relatively small crowd, so I think I can share this myself. So please, if anybody has any questions, reflections, you're very welcome. Yeah, please.
Can I first of all thank you very much indeed, Dr. Winter. That was a very clear talk, and from a Christian perspective, I'm actually from one of the local Baptist churches. I'd like to thank you too for the respectful way that you handled our Bible and presented to us about Ishmael. That was really very helpful, and of course that passage in Genesis does also speak of God promising Hagar that Ishmael would become a great nation. That was a promise clearly given at that time. But it's not the only thing the Bible says, and this is my question. The Bible also says more about Ishmael. One of Ishmael's children was Kedar, and Kedar is mentioned several times in the Bible. He was a man who went to what we now know is Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula. And the prophet Isaiah does speak about Kedar, and he speaks in, for example, Isaiah chapter 42, he speaks about Kedar worshipping the Messiah. And I just wondered if you would like to comment on that, please.
I'm sure the original Hebrew would not have him actually worshipping, but certainly venerating, because it was not part of Old Testament Judaism that the Messiah would be a divine figure. Divinity was for God.
The Messiah being mighty God.
Yeah. Sorry?
Isaiah also speaks of the Messiah being mighty God in Isaiah chapter 9.
Well, the Hebrew would suggest that Lord is the word. It wouldn't be the actual Hebrew word for the divine. It would have been Lord, which, as in Arabic, you can say Rabb of God, which means Lord, but it's legitimate to say Rabb of a human being who is Lord of a particular region, for instance, politically. So it would have been in that sense. But in any case, Muslims don't have, as far as I can recall, in major Islamic texts, any reference to Kedar as one of the sons of Ishmael, and the book of Isaiah himself is not even mentioned in the Quran. So that's a kind of biblical possibility that isn't picked up in the Islamic tradition at all. You will find, however, if you look at commentaries, Quranic commentaries tend to be absolutely bulging with stuff that's sometimes well assimilated, sometimes poorly assimilated recollections of stories that were current in Jewish or Christian communities. You will find that these stories are produced, but that wouldn't really be regarded as authoritative Muslim teaching. It's just of interest. Who's next? If anyone? Yeah, please.
Okay, the media portrays the Muslims in a bad light. How can we overcome this in the UK and Europe? That's part one. And part two is, how can non-Muslims be encouraged to learn about Islam, and what sources can we use for this?
Well, the media presents Islam in a bad light partly because, well, for two reasons. Firstly, that there are plenty of Muslims in various parts of the world who do bad things, and therefore the media report that, like what happened in Bombay. It's hard to put a particularly positive spin on that. But the other problem is that Muslim communities are very bad at representing the mainstream. The fault of the media, I would say, is not systematic bias, but rather that it hasn't occurred to the editors that people might want to know what mainstream Islam has to say about some of the things the extremists do. You can read the Times from cover to cover every day for a year and still not be able to name a single Muslim leader, for instance. All you pick up is news of people who have tiny followings, Abu Hamza and Abu Qatada, and a few people who say or do newsworthy things. But the mainstream leadership is completely unknown to people who consume the media. That's something they have to sort out, but it's also something Muslims have to be more proactive in, and explaining that if you read the Muslim press, you'll see what Muslim leaders say about these events, and maybe it's of interest to Westerners to know what Islam says about Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and those movements. And there are plenty of Westerners who do want to know, but somehow the media aren't making that connection. So it has to be Muslims who take the initiative and have proper press agencies and have the right kind of communications with journalists and newspaper editors to say, why don't you explain our side of the story, because that's also important. The other question is, how can we encourage people to learn more about Islam? The problem in modern Britain is that people don't know anything about any religion. If they don't know anything about the religion of their ancestors, it's a little bit hard to ask them to learn about Islam. And even though I teach in a theology faculty, the level of ignorance amongst students is astounding. I was recently teaching a student And I was talking to her about the Quranic story of Jonah and the whale, Sayyidina Yunus. And she said, what an interesting story. Is it in the Bible as well? That's the level of religious illiteracy in modern Britain. And there's just complete apathy. It's not cool to learn about the Bible or Christianity, what goes on in church. It's not part of the youth culture. So if they're indifferent to learning about Christianity, then it's not really so easy to get them to learn about Islam. You have to do it through befriending people, explaining things to them, being a good example. That's a kind of one-to-one thing. It's hard to change the apathetic, anti-religious culture in society as a whole. I wouldn't know how to do it. Yeah.
Tony Blair said that the issue of religious faith is going to be as important in the 21st century as political ideology, such as communism, for example, in the last century. Do you have any comments or thoughts on that in relation?
Well, so far it's probably true, although in the case of a lot of Islamic activism and in the case of some sections of the Republican Party in America, for instance, the difference between the religious and the political is not always clearly visible. But for the rest of the century, who knows? Nothing about our current situation would have been imaginable even 20 years ago. 20 years ago, the Iron Curtain was still there. It was the end of the Cold War. Nobody had heard of the environmental crisis. All of the things that we're worried about at the moment would have been inconceivable to them. And all of their predictions, if you look at social science or politics textbooks from the 70s and the 80s, everything that they predict, usually in the last chapter, turned out to be complete nonsense. So whether the rest of this century is going to be religious or secular or Islamic or Buddhist or Zoroastrian, or whether there'll even be an end to the century, maybe we'll blow ourselves up or the environment will finally collapse, who knows? That's where religious faith and optimism comes in, I think. Inshallah. Right. Well, first question is really about identity. Can there be a British Islam? It's not something I fuss about particularly. I think this modern preoccupation with having an identity and discovering your identity is something that's very new in history and in most cases creates more problems than it solves. But certainly in Islam, having an ethnic or linguistic identity is very important. That's why when the Sahaba who weren't Arabs became Muslim, their original ethnicity was conserved in their name. So Salman al-Farisi, radiallahu anh, still known as Salman al-Farisi by the Prophet himself, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He was Salman the Persian. He didn't suddenly become an Arab. Suhaib al-Rumi, who came from Byzantium, still known as Suhaib al-Rumi because he came from what's now Asia Minor. The Sahaba who took their Shahada conserved their tribal affiliation. The tribe of Quraysh did not disappear. They're still there. Aus, Khazraj, all of the tribes of Arabia were still there. What changed was that no longer did it have any legal significance. Tribalism was done away with, tribal chauvinism was done away with, but of course people still had a sense of who they were and they could recite their ancestors to you and were proud of that. That's part of being human, I think. And that's why the Quran says, وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا. There's no story of the Tower of Babel and human linguistic difference being some kind of an expression of God's anger. Instead, the Quran says, we have made you peoples and tribes that you might know each other. Human diversity seems to be understood in the Quranic perspective as something to be affirmed, something that's of God's signs. So there's no Sharia reason why you can't be a British Muslim or a Luton Muslim or whatever, as long as it doesn't turn itself into some kind of Jahili tribalism, which is certainly forbidden. Incidentally, in some parts of the world, being a British Muslim is something you don't necessarily want to claim. If you go to Medina, as I sometimes do, the only young people who ever misbehave in the streets of Medina are young British Muslims. The equivalent from Pakistan or Bangladesh or wherever, when they come from Pakistan and Bangladesh, they're from the same generation, they behave with real courtesy and respect. They don't lark around, messing around with the traffic and sort of insulting people and swaggering and hanging out, looking at girls. The British Muslim in Medina is not a very nice thing to be because they've accumulated certain roughness from the Western inner city. I don't know if that's quite what Tony Blair and others have in mind when they speak about British Islam. It already exists, not necessarily a great thing. There's drawbacks as well as positive things to any ethnicity. The other question, which is about Sharia, is something that has to be resolved by individual Muslim communities, and as I indicated, different Muslims have different views as to what the Sharia is, what its current application might be.